welcome to the Vintage Group Build subscriber submission. So this is a group build that happens over in our Discord, and it's just a group of people building a like-minded subject with some like-minded kits. So hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me today as I look through everything that was submitted for this group build. Hopefully, as this is a live stream, you can all... Oh, hello. I've got extra sound. Something's playing in the background. Just bear with me as I get rid of that. It was me. I had the stream open in two places. So let's start this proper. The theme of this one was vintage. So the idea here is that any kit that was sort of manufactured before 1990, although because not everybody can get vintage kits, we did say that anything that was after 1990 had to be a rebox of the original tooling, but without any new parts added. So we've had quite a few people contribute to this. So without any further ado, let's take a look at this. So first up, and these are in no particular order, they're just however they come as I pulled them from the server, we have this one. This is a 1978 Hella Saab J29 Tunnon in 1/72 scale. This is the current rebox, however, which would date itself around the 2020s. They say that the kit was surprisingly decent for the age. They've come across some newer, worse fitting kits with more flash and issues. The detail was all right, but there was, you know, some raised panel lines and things like that. At times it felt like the old molds were redone a little bit. So Hella has actually gone through a process recently where they've been updating their old toolings to make them a little bit better. So for this one, the individual decided they actually wanted to rescribe all the panel lines. That's why you can see that they are recessed now rather than raised, which I think elevates the kit quite a bit. I'm just going to put a message in the chat. There we go. And I'm just reading the notes here. So what happens is people give me notes about their build, and then I'll scan through them and see what they've written. Sometimes some people write loads, and other times people write hardly anything, so I have to kind of guess. In the cockpit, they scratch built some interior details, so it actually represents the aircraft okay. And finally, they experimented with adding some magnets. So the aircraft can be posed with or without the drop tanks attached. That's something I've actually done in the past with my Swift, and I think it does help to change the look of the aircraft. So if you look on the left there, you can see it in the same angle, but with or without the external fuel tanks, which I think does make, it gives you that option, doesn't it? Which I think is always good fun. So for the finish, they've gone for a metallic paint scheme. There is a little bit of variation on the panels, but they don't think it showed up too much in the finished pictures. They enjoyed building this one. It's not too bad of a kit. Obviously they went above and beyond with this one, and I think on the whole it does look very good. I would be tempted to have a go at the Tunnon from Hella in the future, so stay tuned for that one. But yeah, thanks so much for taking part. Let's move on to the next one. It's nice to see so many people in the chat. Here we've got a Airfix 1/32 scale 1926 Morris Cowley, and this was a 1959 tooling, and the actual example here you can see top left I've popped in the actual sprue pics. This is from the 1962 release, so it is truly a vintage kit. Fenris says that they're not particularly happy with this one. It's not their best work, but you know, sometimes people are rushed a little bit to get things completed within the time frame of the build. They say this was an old kit, emphasis on old, possibly the oldest they've ever done. Despite that, though, it went together pretty well. There were some issues with some warping on the windscreen and a gap where the radiator attaches to the chassis. They did correct the warping with a bit of hot water and then bending it back into shape. And for the gap, it was filled with a little bit of plastic card and a bit of extra putty to fix the seams. They think it is visible in the final shots, though, if you go looking for it. So there is potentially a little bit of untidiness, but you know what? For a 1959 tooling and for a kit that came from the 1960s, I think you've done a good job here. I've actually got something similar. It's not the same car. It's a different tooling, different vehicle. But hopefully if mine turns out looking like yours, I'll be quite happy. So yeah, well done. Let's move on to an aircraft now. This is a vintage kit for a vintage group build. So this is from Hawk, and you can see bottom right. Some of them I include the sprue pictures if I think it's a particularly interesting boxing. The kit says that it's an AU1, but it actually is more likely to be an F4U1 Delta. So that's what they've done here. They've painted it a little bit differently to what perhaps was the instructions, and they've painted it as a F4U rather than an AU1. In total, there were 37 pieces in this kit. Some of them had flash, but easy to fix. And it gave the feeling to this modeler that it was designed to be built in an afternoon. They were quite happy with the detail. It was quite surprising. The wings, despite the age, has recessed panel lines, and the walkways have a texture to them. Unfortunately, when they were priming it, the primer they used didn't work too well, and they did lose some of the details and had to rescribe some of them. Twice, they say. The engineering of the kit is not great. There's no locating pins or guides as to where the pieces should go, and the rocket's drop tank, landing gear and wheel doors were a bit of a struggle to put on. This took most of their energy to get through the project, and it was like half of all the pieces were problematic in ways. The landing gear, they say, is a bit of a weak point. It wobbles, so it's not particularly sturdy. And the way that they finished this was brush painting with enamel paints, which is a nice old school way of doing things. The colour is Humbrol 15 Midnight Blue. They like the final colour, so they left it as is. It's interesting that your Humbrol 15 is darker than the Humbrol 15 I've used on other kits. So perhaps you had an older pot, because the current one I used was much brighter. So to replicate it as an F4U1D, they've used spare decals from an Academy kit. So all in all, it's a pretty nice kit, fairly detailed for its age, and would build it again despite the fact it has some engineering problems. But yeah, I think given the age of the kit, you've done a really good job of this. It looks really good. So thanks for submitting that one. Up next, we've got some interesting pictures here. So the primary subject for this one was the F4J from Hasegawa, which is originally boxed in 1989, so just before the cutoff for our group build. They say the build was pretty uneventful, so it's a fairly decent tooling despite the age. It's still obvious that it's from the early 80s, the main issue being some of the parts don't go together as they perhaps otherwise would, and some parts that would be one solid part that would then slot into something instead of two halves that need to be glued together, and there is some rough edges and things that needed cleaning up. The bottom of the aircraft is one whole part, which means that some gaps and seams needed to be filled when they came to build it. The gear bays easily allowed for a gear up display, though the lack of provision for a stand forces you to get creative on how to display it. A pilot and figures are included and are quite nice. It makes you wonder if they got retooled at some point, so it's quite possible that maybe that did happen. The diorama was a result of a few coincidences, they say. Recreating a dogfight from Vietnam between the crew of Showtime 100 and MiG-17 3020. So they're not sure who the pilot was on that one because they swapped them out. So the MiG-17 is from the Airfix kit, and they've done a little diorama here to show the two aircraft as they effectively merge. And yeah, this is very cool. I like this. This is really creative. I like it when people do dioramas, especially when they've got extra time to do it. Group builds on our Discord server tend to take about 4 months duration, which means that people have got some time to focus on them if they'd like to. One thing I do particularly like is that you can see that the aircraft, the F4 at the very least, has been doing some combat, and it seems to be missing a couple of missiles and stores. So it's at a point where it has been doing things. Right, let's move on. Thank you very much for sending that one in. We're going to stick with the jet theme, maybe a slightly earlier jet. This is a Airfix 1/72nd scale McDonnell F2H2P Banshee. And I'm pretty sure Lucas Bruce has actually made a video about this on their channel if you want to go and check this one out. But this one features an aircraft from White 12 from VMJ-1, the Marine Squadron that flew in the underappreciated photo Banshee during the Korean War. They've heard it said that the VMJ-1 was responsible for about 40% of all photo intelligence used in that conflict. Although no Banshee ever shot down a MiG-15, whenever they encountered them, they would always slip away unharmed, and only 2 were lost to ground fire, apparently, which is interesting. So they're glad to have a model which represents this type and the contribution that it made. They think it does look a bit strange with the longer nose compared to the normal Banshee, but this is what Lucas Proofs like. They like slightly odd looking aircraft. There was a bit of modification to this kit. They did a 3D printed cockpit camera bay, creating a new nose out of clear vacuum formed styrene, designing and getting custom decals printed. So they've done quite a lot of customization to this kit. And they also rescribed the panel lines, which, you know, old kits are great for this sort of thing, to experience and to try out new techniques. They're happy with how the cockpit paint and the printed decals, which came from Laser Shark Design, turned out, although they do think they could improve a few areas with a bit of sanding around the tail and the nose. Just checking what they've written here. They use some oil paint weathering, which they're quite happy with. And they have used an enamel wash for the engine oxide effect and some oils for the black burns, rather than the entire exhaust. But I think it looks okay. That's a really good, almost like a upgrade, isn't it? Adding all the extra details that you did. Of course, in some respects, you can't see all the details because inside the cockpit, some things are hidden. But this is a very nicely upgraded kit from the base model. And you can see in there top right, that's the original Airfix box that it would have come in. So yeah, thanks so much for taking part. We're going to swing into something a little bit different now. We're going to go to a locomotive. This is a Monogram Snap Tight, New York Central Hudson. This is a 1982 tooling. So they say this one wasn't difficult, and seeing as it's like a snap together model kit, it would make sense. The kit went together well. They applied the decals that came in the kit. Sorry, no, they didn't. They didn't apply the decals that came in the kit because they were unusable. So they've got some new ones made or purchased from Microscale. Yeah, this is looking pretty nice. It's a pretty large locomotive, and I think you've done a pretty good job of putting this one together. And it's always good to see something a little bit different. So thank you for contributing. Let's move on. This is a Revell 1/72 scale RA5C Vigilante, which I think is a 1982 tooling, but this is a 1989 rebox. They say the box was in pretty good condition, but the decals were yellowed and unusable. So they've used aftermarket decals, and they also had to replace the pitot tube with something from the stash. The kit does have recessed panel lines, but it's not particularly detailed or accurate compared to other modern kits. They did add seat belts to the pilots from the masking tape, and although they did this, it is a bit hard to see them inside the cockpit. The build was fun, they say, but most parts needed some sand, dry fitting, and oftentimes some force to keep them in place whilst the glue dried. There was a bit of filler used, but not too much. Pre-shading quite heavily was applied before painting, and they also did some post-shading after paint was applied. Some of the missing panel lines they tried to simulate with a bit of post-shading, get some contrast, and also oil washes were used on the panels. They like the Vigilante as it has an impressive size, and they love the shape and look of the aircraft. It almost has like an F-15 kind of vibe to it, if it had a twin tail. Yeah, I like this. I think you've done a really good job with the older tooling and adding the extra weathering to help bring out the limited details that are there. So yeah, well done. Let's move on to a slightly earlier aircraft. This is another Hella kit. This is a 1974 tooling, but the 2020 rebox of the P-51D Mustang. And I did build one of these a few years back. It is a bit of a clunky kit. It does have raised details and things. You can see that this person has tried their best. I think they were limited with the paints they had access to. So they've used Mr. Hobby and Tamiya paints, which are notoriously difficult to hand paint with, which may explain the slightly untidy paint finish on there. What I would suggest is either swapping to a water-based paint, or if you're using alcohol-based paints, because it is possible to paint with alcohol-based paints, is to thin them down and then paint on one layer and then completely like walk away. Just leave it to dry for like a whole day. Treat it almost like an enamel, and then perhaps when you come back to it and do another layer on top, you won't reactivate it, because that's the problem with acrylic based alcohol based acrylics, is that they can be reactivated much more easily than sort of water based ones. So that would be my suggestion. But you know, scale modeling is all a learning curve, so hopefully on the next one you'll have learnt from some of the things that you did here, and have something to explore further. So thank you so much for taking part. This is a kit that I quite like the idea of, and although this is the SK Models 1/72 scale Westland Whirlwind, it's actually the Airfix tooling. So the Airfix tooling was from 1977, but this SK model kit is a rebox from 1994. But I think they use new decals. They say this is the oldest tooling they've ever done. And this kit was originally released in 1991, but the parts are from 1977 tooling, and the overall fit of the build is fairly decent. The wing halves needed a bit of work to put them together, but they say the most painful part of the build was the gear bay doors. They come in one piece, so you have to cut them in half to attach the landing gear in the lowered position. They painted this with Humbrol acrylics, but they did use some other things as well. They did use primer on this. They say this is the first model that they have primed, and they did notice a difference between painting on a primed surface compared to painting just on the plastic, which I would agree, painting on a primed surface does usually make it a bit easier. They say the fit of the parts was generally okay, and the kit, sorry, just checking the notes here, Tamiya paint. So they say they were talking about some Tamiya paints here, because they've I think they're mentioning here that they've painted Tamiya paints before, and they've had the same problem as the previous poster. So they're saying that they mentioned that this Tamiya paints, they're put off because they can be a bit clumpy, and I would agree. So they've used Humbrol acrylics on this one, as well as some extra acrylics for the dark sea grey. Some of the decals, when they applied them, were bent, so that was a bit of a struggle. They had to fix some of the rips, so decal fix was used to help soften them into the surface and prevent any silvering. They say on the whole they enjoyed this kit. They have never painted a figure for an aircraft before, so they've done the pilot for this one as well, and they're really proud of their canopy painting. And do you know what? I think you did a really good job of this one. I really like the look of the Whirlwind. I think it's a really interesting aircraft. Technically, it was in service during the Battle of Britain, whilst it, never actually, I don't think, took part in combat during the Battle of Britain. It was technically in service. So it's a bit of an oddity. The people who talked about the Whirlwind said it was a really good aircraft, but it just didn't quite go anywhere. I did think that perhaps Airfix might rebox their Whirlwind at some point as part of the Vintage Classics range, but other than that, I'm not entirely sure which other toolings are available. I know there's like 1 in 148 from Trumpeter, which might be worth looking at, but here I think this is a very good example of what you could do with the Airfix tooling. So well done. Let's move on. This is a Academy HH60D Nighthawk from 1987, but they've done it in a Japanese UH60J in a blue camouflage scheme. It is another Black Hawk that they've done, but they really couldn't pass up the opportunity to do the Japanese version. The radome is a replacement part from an Italeri Black Hawk kit, and they've used some other decals and things as well. The various sensor arrays and antenna are made from paper, so a little bit of an adaptation there. Because they used paper for some of the antenna, they did have a bit of warping there, so they've tried their best to straighten it out, but these things happen. And they've used acrylic paint to paint the model, and the biggest brush and hand painting to complete the sort of waves on the difference between the upper and the lower side surfaces. Unfortunately, they did have a bit of a struggle with this one, in the sense that the dog knocked the kit off the table whilst they were working on it and broke the tail rotor off. So it is a bit rattly. It's not as stable as it once was after they reattached it. They didn't have the correct bubble windows for the crew that sits behind the pilots. So there's no bubble window on this one, which makes it a little bit inaccurate, but I wouldn't have known if you hadn't have told me. The decals from the kit were pretty yellowed, and they flipped each decal over and scraped off the yellowing from the decals. I presume that would be some decals have a almost like a setting chemical or a glue or something on the back of them. Some of them don't, some of them do. So potentially that's what's yellowed there. They wish they had some filler because there was some gaps around the engine, which they really wanted to fix, but they didn't have any at the time. So I think they're being overly critical of themselves, but I think they've done a really good job here. So well done. It's interesting to have something that looks like this on the group build, and you can see I put a little picture at the top right there just of what it looked like after they got it out of the box. So thanks for taking part. Let's move on to a prop engine aircraft. This is a 1971 original Airfix DHC Beaver in 1/72nd scale. They had to use some decals from a Harrier though to replicate what should have been on there. I think probably because the decals included just didn't work. I think bottom right, if you have a look there, you can see the decals included. They are massively out of register, so they don't look very good there. The kit went together very well for such an old boxing. There were a couple of issues. The top panel of the fuselage had bowed or warped over time, but they managed to fix it with cement and clamps. And the doors wouldn't fit perfectly, so they had to sand them back into shape to get them into their little holes. The flight stand was included, as was quite typical of the time for Airfix kits back in the day. And I would agree with you that they probably should think about including them again. I think the only time we've seen the vintage stands included was with the biplanes that they released a little while ago. They say that the whole project took about 7 hours from start to finish, and they're pretty happy with the results. And yeah, you should be proud of this one. I know it was quite a quick build, but you've done a pretty good job. So well done. Let's move on to something that's not aircraft related, and is in fact a Airfix HMS Victory in 1/180 scale. So the tooling is from 1965, but this is a more recent rebox from 2018 as part of the Vintage Classics range. They say that despite the age, it goes together pretty well. There are a few bits of aging problems creeping in though, but they say most of the problems were caused by themselves, being a little bit clumsy. The rat lines is the downside to the model. Over the years, this person has learnt which rigging is important and which can be left off. I wouldn't know personally because I don't really do ships. And they decided not to put the sails on for the ship to be seen in all its glory. So even considering its age, they do actually recommend this one if you want to try something a bit different. And I think this looks pretty impressive. You can see all of the rigging and extra lines that they've added, and the painting is really neat. It's I just find ships personally to be a bit daunting due to the amount of rigging. I don't even like doing biplanes because of the rigging. So, you know, hats off to you. Well done. Next up, we're going back to aircraft. And we have a Airfix 1978 1/72nd scale FW190D or Dora. So this is Yellow 10, piloted by Major Franz Gross, and it was a complex paint scheme, but they're proud of how it's turned out. So they enjoyed painting this one. I kind of always wanted to do the FW190 from Airfix back in the day, so I would have been looking for this example, but I don't think I ever did one of these. Granted, by today's standards, it's a bit simple, it's a bit clunky. It's, you know, they've got a more recent FW190, but not in the D version. But I think on the whole, it looks like you've hand painted this and you've done the modeling by hand, which is quite impressive. So, you know, good job, well done. Thanks for taking part. Let's move on. This is very different now. This may well be a first in the sense that we don't think we've had any dinosaur bones. I know Fenris has submitted dinosaurs before, but never a skeleton. So this is a Palmer Plastics American Mastodon from 1959. There's no official scale. It's like a fit the box kind of deal. They say that the modern scientific accuracy is a bit lacking, but they wanted to keep the original late 1950s feel of the kit intact instead of heavily correcting or updating it, which, you know, makes sense. The idea was to present it like a museum display, so they added custom wire supports, which are inspired by the visible mounting hardware that you see on skeletal exhibits when you go to museums. The kit had a lot of issues that you would expect from something of this vintage. The plastic was pretty brittle, and the fit and engineering shows its age. They had to use some filler on the seams and super glue to hold it together, but they enjoyed the painting process because there was, as they say, no real wrong way to do it. You're painting bones and you're adding weathering and aging, etc. So you're doing that sort of fossilizing paint effect on there, which is really good. The display base helps make it look like a museum exhibit, and they're quite happy with that one. There is a Rust-Oleum fossil spray paint, which was used as the base colour, and then they added the darker tones and texture using Tamiya acrylics. So actually, we talk about Tamiya acrylics being difficult to hand paint, but in this case, if you did want it to be a bit streaky and clumpy, that's what it would be perfect for. I really like where you went with this one. Yeah, it's probably not scientifically accurate anymore, but it was probably the best that they could do at that time. And I would agree, it does look like you've done a museum exhibit. So well done. I think you hit exactly what you wanted to do there. Up next is a HE162A2 Volksjager from 1988. This is 1/48 scale from the brand TriMaster. They said that for the age of the kit, it was surprising that it had a lot of extra parts. It had nose weight included, photo etch parts, several metal parts like the ejection seat, and the landing gear and engine area. The plastic parts had some detail with engraved panel lines, and the fit was alright for the most part. It did get a bit bad in a few places, where they had to fill a large gap on one of the wings, but for the most part they were pretty happy. You decided to add seatbelts because there were none in the kit, and you like how they look for the first time that you've done this. But they say the biggest struggle was with the decals. They were a bit fragile, and almost every single one went a bit silvery underneath. So that is why they've done heavy weathering, is to try and hide the silvering. Something else they want to talk about is the engine. It does have a good amount of detail out of the box, but they did add their own wires and other scratch-built elements. So they're pretty happy with how this one's turned out due to the level of detail they've managed to squeeze into it. They've done a little display base with this one. It's what they say, they tried to represent the wood used on the real aircraft. So the HE162 was built out of a lot of wood because they were trying to save resources at the point this was being built in the war. So they've done a wooden base to represent that, and they've added a little bit of scenery and grass and the figure there as well. They like the kit. It was a little bit of a challenge in some areas, and the detail and quality for its time was actually quite good. So well done. It does look really good. I like that you see engine details. The silvering is a little bit noticeable, but you've done your best there to try and hide that. But this is the problem with old decals. Sometimes you just don't get them to work quite right. Up next is a very interesting little scene, effectively. We've got the Airfix DH8D8 Comet, which is from the 2014 release. So you can see top right, that's the boxing that it was. Which still blows my mind because this is like a 1958 tooling, and I know that us in the UK have had this released as a special limited edition product in Lidl recently, and you know it's so mad that even in 2026 it was in production, but 2014 when they released it, it was just like a standard boxing, despite the fact it's such an old and tatty kit. But what they've done here is they've replicated the McRobertson Air Race winner. It's in 1/72 scale, and they've got Grosvenor House, the paint scheme here, which is probably one of the more famous ones. Interestingly, as a side point, I think it was yesterday from when I'm making this video. If you didn't hear about it, this aircraft did actually suffer an accident. The pilot, we've been told, was conscious and has survived the incident, but the aircraft did end up on its roof and there was damage to the tail and other bits and pieces. So unfortunately we don't know at this moment in time what's going to happen to the actual flying example of this. But talking about, yeah, so hopefully they managed to repair the aircraft and hopefully the pilot makes a full recovery. So talking about this aircraft then, they've done it as if it's the actual McRobertson air racer coming out of the poster for that air race. And I think you've done a very good job of this one. This is a clunky kit. It is tatty. It's probably not one of the best kits that Airfix has, but you've managed to fill every gap, or most of them. You've got a nice smooth paint finish on there. You can see you've done canopy framework when the kit doesn't have any. They used Mr. Color products. They want to do a bit more improving to the canopy because it's such a clunky kit. There are going to be bits where things don't fit together. But sometimes you just got to cut your losses and move on. So the background is inspired from the Gundam community, and it's called Shattered Mirror, where it's sort of like coming out of the background towards you, which I really like. It's different, it's unique. I think you've done a really good job, despite the fact this is such an old kit, and you've made it look really good. So well done. Up next is a Tamiya Mitsubishi J2M3 in 1/48 scale. This is a tooling from 1973. They say the kit was pretty interesting to build. They think it turned out well, but perhaps they were a little bit clumsy with the build in a few places. There is a seam around the fuselage and wing. It could be poor alignment, or perhaps they weren't quite as accurate with gluing it together, but it does exist. The painting, though, they were pretty happy with that. They did it with an airbrush, and they went for bare metal. So this is aluminium, I think. They didn't have enough time to do any chipping fluid and paint it with a camouflage scheme, so they just left it in bare metal. But I think that's okay. They used ICM silver paint for it, and then they applied the decals. They say the decals went okay, and then the weathering was pretty good as well. They've done dust pigments from Vallejo, which should mimic dust and grime on the aircraft, and they applied a Tamiya panel liner wash. They did do some enamel as well to further enhance different areas, and then they used some black pigments for the engine staining. They added a tarp on the glass, to protect it whilst it was not in use, and then they added the figure, which was their first time painting one of those. They then made a little dusty diorama base to give almost like the feeling that this had been semi-abandoned, maybe forgotten about at the edge of the airfield. I can see where you were going with this one. I think you've done a really good job of it. Tamiya kits, even some of their older ones, are still pretty decent models to build, and I really like the little customizations you've done with this one. So good job, well done. Let's move on to the next subject. This is a Tamiya, so sticking with Tamiya, Buccaneer S Mark II in 1/100 scale. This is the 1971 release. They say it's a nice simple kit. There's only 4 steps to build this one, and there's not many parts, but unlike other Tamiya kits, it has raised panel lines. But that's, typical of kits of this age. So what you can see there is they've done a bit of modulation and things with the paintwork to try and give a bit more shading and things to those areas. The painting instructions, they say, were vague, and the decal sizes are a little bit hit and miss. The decals, though, held up pretty well. There was no yellowing on them, but they were a bit brittle. So they tried their best to apply them. I think you did okay. They say that this was a fun build, and it was also their first Tamiya kit. So, yeah, I think you've done a good job of that. You can see on the bottom that it's got like a customizable bomb bay in the actual Buccaneer. It would rotate the whole bomb bay, and you can see there that they have that option to do that. I think you can literally just swap it in and out. I really like where you went with this one. 100 scale is a bit smaller than 72, so there would be bits on this which might be a little bit tricky, but for the most part I would say you've done a really good job. I would look for one of these myself. I don't know if Tamiya is still manufacturing these, but it could be a nice fun little build. Thanks for sending that one in. Let's take a look at another aircraft. This is a LTV A7E Corsair 2 from VA83 Rampages. This is the AMT/Ertl kit, but the Esky tool, I believe, in 1/72 scale. So it's a 1988 release from a 1977 tool. They say the kit went together well. The canopy wasn't that good, though. It did leave a bit of a gap. I think if you look carefully, you can see there's a little bit of a gap on the canopy there. Although they did their best to try and fill some of the areas. The main landing gear does have some detail, but they did add a few extra bits and pieces. There wasn't any detail in the nose gear bay, so they had to build a cover to hide that. They used aftermarket decals, but unfortunately they were a bit fragile. They say that they started falling apart when they left the decal sheet. They say that this was supposed to be a VA-87 aircraft, but the stripes on the tail ended up being completely destroyed during the application of the transfers, so they went for VA-83 instead. I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know the accuracy of this one. I can't say that I know particularly too much about the Corsair, but they say despite the decals' best effort to end themselves, they're satisfied with the end results, and you should be. This has turned out pretty well. I like the weathering. It does look pretty grimy, pretty well used, as these aircraft probably would have done when they were out at sea on the carriers. So for an old tooling, well done. And this is what I like about vintage builds, is there's no real right or wrong. You're just helping something meet its destiny, which is something that the next person has also done. This is a Novo 1/72nd scale Fokker F567. It's 7B-3M Southern Cross. 1966 tooling, but a 1978 release. So I imagine this is the Frog tooling from 1966. This person says that they may not be as pretty or as good as it could be, but it's good enough. If nothing else, this gave them some practice with masking and 3D modeling. So they modeled the propellers because they broke them, or they were broken in the box. They say on the whole it's not a bad kit. Even if the tooling wasn't the greatest in the world, it was a fun project. And that's it. Sometimes if you build an older kit, you may not be building the best kit, but it's about having fun. And that's something that I really enjoy about building vintage kits. And I can tell that you had a lot of fun here. And you also did something different by making your own props on 3D software, which is good too. So thanks for sending that one in. Let's have a look at another Novo kit, which is the rebox of the Frog 1957 tooling 1/72nd scale Fairy Delta II. The Novo kit dates from 1977. They say this was a second-hand purchase, which was pretty cheap. It's a pretty old tooling from 1957, which means that there were some issues in a few places, but despite that, it was quite nice. The fit was surprisingly good, apart from the canopy, which was not great at all. And it does have recessed panel lines, which is another interesting thing for the age. The cockpit or gear bay interior doesn't really exist. There's no details in there. So, you just sort of hide that and not make it visible. The transfers, unfortunately, were cracked. And I can relate to that because these Novo decals don't survive. And apparently, even when they were brand new, they would just fall apart. So what they did is got some extra decals, roundels and numbers, which allowed them to do the one we see here, which is Whiskey Golf 777 in its blue and silver paint scheme, which it wore for a grand total of 4 days from the 27th of June until the 1st of July 1957. Normally it would have been in silver, which they say would be less visually interesting, so they've done it in the blue. They would have liked to have done it in magenta, but they couldn't find the transfers for all of those particular markings. Its nose can droop, which is pretty cool, which is a remnant of a bygone era in which models were both for those who want to display and also play with. So there's a little bit of play value in there. They say on the whole, it's not their best work, but they're pretty happy with how it came out. And yeah, I would agree. It looks good. I think it looks good. We are our own worst critics, aren't we? We always spot more flaws in our projects than we do necessarily in others. And I would say you've done a really good job of such an old kit, and you've helped it meet its destiny. So well done. Up here is a 1/72nd scale Sopwith Camel from Academy, and is the 1984 tool. And Academy are still selling this kit, I'm pretty sure. It's pretty cheap. I think these days you can get it for around £4 here in the UK. It's not terrible. I think I built one in my youth. It works. It goes together. This person says the quality is adequate for the age. The good things about this kit is it's cheap, like I just mentioned. You can get it for about £4. It has a low part count, so you build it quite quickly, and the fit is generally okay. There wasn't that much flash on their example either. However, there are some issues, such as it has ejector pin marks like right in the middle of the wing, so you've got to fix that. There's no cockpit detail really. The machine guns aren't particularly detailed, and the engine is lacking detail too. The decals also are too big. So for their build, they assembled it, following the instructions quite easily, filling on the ejector pin marks, did a bit of rigging, but they struggled with getting the cables in the correct positions. For the painting, they tried pre-shading, doing straight dark lines under the fabric to simulate light and darkness, and picking up on the wooden structure, and they're quite happy with it. The green is an olive green which was applied, and the decals were okay, but they weren't conforming to the surface very well. They wanted to do more weathering, but in the end all they did was put a wash on it, and sometimes less is more, isn't it? They say they didn't go very ambitious with the project, but they think they'll do something a bit more adventurous for the next group build. Do you know what? I think this looks fine. I think you did a good job. I like the weathering. I like the subtle paintwork. I like the shading effect you've got there with the ribs on the wings. I think you did a really good job. It's nice sometimes just to do a nice clean build. So good job. Well done. Next up is me. So this is what I submitted. This is my Hella BF109F. This was from the 1972 boxing, and it even came with a little glue capsule in the sealed bag, but that had popped open. Some of the struggles I had with this kit was that the canopy has fogging on it, which I can't do anything about because it was already there inside the bag from that glue capsule, which must have popped at some point in the past. The decals did have yellowing, although I tried to use a UV light box to try and clean it up. I did actually end up having to cut around the decals to remove the yellowed clear element of it because it just wouldn't work. But actually the decals went on okay and they didn't fall apart, which was good. I used Vallejo Model Air to paint this one, and I did some simple weathering such as a dark wash and some smoke staining. The build was all right. I did a little bit of work on sanding some seams, but to be honest, I was doing this quite quickly just to get the project completed. But for the most part, it's a clunky kit. It's got raised details. It's probably not as dimensionally accurate as it could be, but I enjoyed it. It was nice to do. I don't think at this point I'd ever done a Mediterranean or tropical paint scheme for a BF109. So actually it was really nice to do something a little bit different. And I am quite happy with this one, despite the fact it's an old kit. It had been sat in my stash for a few years, but it's complete now. So yeah, I would say well done, but that I just had fun. Next person up has completed an Esky F16. This is from the 1983 tooling, and unfortunately this person seems to have neglected to have written a write-up. So I did scan back through how they got on with the build, and one thing they did point out was that they struggled with the application of the decals. You can see I've put a little bit of one of their build photos in there as well, because again this person only submitted one image by my recollection of it. I think you did a good job. I think it looks okay. It's there's a few little areas I think around the kit you can see where perhaps the age of the tooling is showing up a little bit, a few little seams and things, but I think you did your best to clean this one up and make it look presentable. So well done. Let's move on to another 3-engined aircraft, which is the originally a Frog kit, but it then went to Novo and then Sabre and things. So this has been reboxed a number of times. This is the Fokker F7 3M again. I think we saw this earlier, didn't we? But in a different paint scheme. What we've got here is, I'm just going to check their notes. So the kit had decals for two versions of the famous Southern Cross, and they wanted to do a more regular civilian version, so they made their own decals for a Belgian one. So that's what we've got here. We've got a Belgian civil one. But back on the bottom left, you can see where this came from. I've heard of old models. I get the feeling that old models is like genuinely a second-hand kit that they've put in a new box and then put I don't think it's a remanufactured one. I think it is generally from a certain time period and they put it in a new box. That's basically what it is. It's almost like an eBay or auction site find and they've just put a new box on it to tidy it up. Your build though, they say that there was a slight difference between the two fuselage halves. They said there was a bit of warping that it looks like, so they had to do some sanding and filling to get that resolved. But the build was relatively straightforward and simple after that. One thing they did do was sort out the bigger side windows for the passenger area and also make new windows and interior to add a bit of extra detail. The windows come from some plastic clear packaging and the chairs they made from cardboard and plastic spare parts. Of course, unless you get right up close, you're not really going to see that from far away. But I like this one. This one looks really good. I think the extra addition of the airline poster, which you've used as a display base, is pretty fun. So well done. Let's move on to a Harrier. This is the Hasegawa 1/72 scale Harrier GR3 from 1984. This was from the tooling was 1984, but the re-release was from 2008. But that being said, the GR3 tooling is based on the GR1 tooling from 1969, so it's a bit of a adaptation over time. This is a Harrier GR3 of number 4 Squadron in RAF Germany at Gütersloh from around 1980. They say this was their second go at doing this kit. The first time they suffered some major paint issues, and when they tried to wipe away the panel line wash, it didn't go so well. So I'm not sure what your problem was with it, but they make reference to the decals there. So perhaps when you did your wash, you took the decals off. So they had another go. The kit itself suffered a lot of flash, not really any fit issues, but they did make some modifications and cut out the intake vents around the engine, as these would have been open whilst it was stationary to increase airflow. There are some accuracy issues, and the location of the light on the top and the length of the wing legs, which sometimes give it a noticeable lean. Luckily for them, they always plan to display this hovering, so it isn't much of a problem. The decals were a bit thick, so I spent a bit of time cutting them down. This was mostly brush painted using Vallejo, the only sprayed parts being the metallic areas such as the rocket pods. They say it was a pretty good build overall, fairly happy with it, but perhaps the panel wash is a little heavy in places. Do you know what? I think it's okay. I think aircraft of that time period, particularly Harriers, probably did get quite dirty, so a heavy panel line wash is fine. Your build looks really good. I would like to have a go at one of these, but I always get a little bit... I don't know what it is. There's something about Harriers that always intimidate me. I've only built one Harrier on my channel in the past, but maybe having looked at yours, I'll look at doing one in the future. Of course, I need to build some more models out of my stash before I do that. Let's move on. Thanks for sending that one in. This is a SMER 1/72 scale Volti V72-A31 Vengeance. This is a 1995 rebox of the 1989 tooling. Said it was a nice kit. They enjoyed it quite a bit. It was a pretty simple project. There wasn't that much that bothered them. The build was easy, but there was a lot of flash to clean up. They didn't weather it, as it had raised panel lines, so they did the panel lines, they sort of picked it out with a pencil. Despite the age of the decals, they held up pretty well and didn't fall apart. And they did enjoy building it, trying out another dive bomber. They don't like the rear gun, however. They think it looks a bit big, a bit chunky, a bit weird for its size. But other than that, they thought it was a pretty good kit for its age. Yeah, I think you've done a good job of this one. There's a nice neat paintwork. Build looks pretty clean. Canopy framework's nice and neat. Not bad. I haven't built many SMER kits myself. I've got one of their Spitfires, which I think is actually a hella rebox to have a go at some point in the future. So hopefully if mine turns out anything like yours, I'll be pretty happy. Let's swing away from aircraft. Thanks for sending that one in, and move on to a vehicle. This is the Airfix Scammell Tank Transporter in its vintage classic boxing, and they've done it in a European paint scheme. So this is a 1/76 scale vehicle of the Scammell. It was a 2019 rebox, but it's based on the 1962 tooling. They said this one was a faff. They struggled with the undercarriage or the chassis. They found the instructions to be vague, and they just decided to paint it in the European paint scheme. There was some weathering they did on it, but they think it looks a bit dodgy in places. But they thought it was fun. It was a fun project, and that's it, isn't it? Even if a kit is bad and you didn't do it quite as well as you want, the main point of building your models is to have fun. I like where you went with this one. Perhaps you'll be able to add a tank on the back of it at some point. It's a bit frustrating, I suppose, that these kits don't come with glazing. I presume it didn't come with glazing. I know I've got like an AEC Matador in the stash, which has no glazing, which is a right pain. You would think that Airfix would add that as an upgrade at some point, but I guess they haven't got around to it yet. Well done for sending this one in. Let's move on to someone who likes planes. This is an Airfix Dassault Bruet / Dornier Alpha Jet in 1/72 scale. From the 1980 tooling, but is a 2008 rebox. Is this a Hella kit originally? I don't remember if Airfix had one. So someone let me know in the comments, in the live chat. I'm sure that you'll let me know if this is the Hella kit, or if Airfix genuinely did have a tooling. They say this should have taken like a week or 2 weeks at most, but they had to have a break and come back to it after about 2 months. The biggest problems about this kit are the decals and the landing gear. They've had Mistercraft kits with better quality decals than this one. Yeah, and this is the thing with this time period of Airfix kits, is that they were okay decals, but they're not like they are now. And I actually think some of them were inkjet printed, because you can see like little dots where they were printed. So they're not the best era of Airfix decals. They say the landing gear half fell into the gear bay or just completely fell out of the model, so the fit there wasn't great. But other than that, the build went pretty well. So I've got comments on the live chat saying that it is potentially an Airfix tooling. Thanks for letting me know. They need to thin down their paints. They've identified this themselves. They said they need to thin down their paints more and unblock their airbrush. Airbrushing is a bit of a battle. If you've got a blocked airbrush, it can be kind of prevented through the thinning of the paint when you're applying it. But obviously yours is blocked, so that's why you didn't use it. You hand painted this one, which we can see. They say the kit cost them a tenner. For that price, it's not horrible considering it's an 80s tooling. Do you know what? Yes, hand painting, airbrushing, always a bit of a debate there. You hand painted this one. I think airbrushing may have been a bit more smoother in your paintwork once you've managed to unblock your airbrush. Give it a good clean it all out, and then like spray some cleaning fluid through it. That should help. In this case, I think you would have needed to thin down your hand-painted paints a little bit more, because you can see they are a bit thick in places. There are some brush marks. I find also working in opposite directions. So put your first layer down in one direction, and then once that one is dried, go in the other direction, and it should like go crisscross and try and avoid brush marks. I think, though, you've added your little just diorama base, which helps to make it look a little bit more visually interesting. So thanks for sending it in. Thanks for taking part. This one is a Airfix 1/72 scale Bristol 170 Super Freighter Mark 32. Originally a 1959 tooling, but was re-released in 2024 as part of the Airfix Vintage Classics range. I actually considered getting one of these, but having had a terrible experience with the Rotodyne, well, it wasn't terrible, but not a great experience with the Rotodyne, I decided that I didn't want to have a go at another clunky old kit. But it's good that someone else has. So they did have some problems towards the end of the build, but they decided to submit it at this point anyway. They say the fit of the kit is questionable, which I'm not surprised given the age of the tooling. The rear landing gear just cannot support the tail. They had a bit of a combination of horrific paint peeling by the masking set, and the windows are awful. So they're not particularly happy with this particular project. Things they did like about this one was that it was fun making the paint scheme for the aircraft in a fictional RAF trooper aircraft being repainted. So it's like it's an aircraft that's been sold and they're stripping the paint off so that it can be used for British United Air Ferries. They added some extra decal post-war type D RAF roundels to the aircraft. And that's the kind of position they got to. I think they've talked about in their actual build log that they sanded all the raised rivets off, which you can see in the bottom right there, because they were just overscale and chunky. And I know other people have done that with these old kits and then rescribed and then riveted recessed rivets into them, which is just, I mean, if that's what you enjoy, absolutely go for it. But personally, to me, that would be, I probably would, that's all I would do in a year, is just one kit if I had to do that. So yeah, well done. I know you struggle with this one, but I think it looks good. Thanks for taking part. This is the one we saw right at the beginning when the stream started. This is the Testers / Hawk 1/72 scale SPD Dauntless from 1956. The scheme they've used here is the VS-37, which was an anti-submarine warfare aircraft in the Atlantic Fleet in 1944. They say the kit is very representative of its time. It hasn't got many parts, so you could build it quite quickly as a child and then go outside and throw it around. They say the build went relatively smoothly. The fit was actually quite good despite the age of the tooling. They did use some sprue goo. They did have to sprue goo a chuck that was taken out of the, chunk that was taken out of the front cowling, probably a mold defect due to its age. And it's surprising to see so much recessed panels on a kit of this age. So it comes with the recessed panels, which is quite interesting. Of course, if you look carefully, you can see that the roundel on the side is recessed on there as well. That was typical of that age, almost like they go, this is where it goes, put it here, or paint it on yourself. Other than planks to glue the crew on, there's no internal details, so they did some scratch building in the cockpit. They made a headrest for the pilot. They did a little belt for the tail gunner, and they added the little area between the pilot and gunner that had navigation and radio equipment. The crew figures, they were usable, but they didn't have much detail. The decals from Testers were fine, but probably not as good as more modern ones, and they say that they seem to have issues settling into the recessed panel line. They did use a lot of micro set and sol, but they just didn't quite conform, which is a shame. But that happens sometimes with older decals, especially if they're a little bit thick. Painting was done with Vallejo. They used the US Navy sets insignia white and dark gold grey. They did use a bit of hand painting in a few little areas just to fix any overspray. Ammo's PLW Deep Grey was used for the panel line wash. They say that although this kit hasn't been in production, I think the last run of this was in 2009. They would build it again if they get another example of it. They say it builds up quite nicely, and if you get out of your comfort zone and want to do a bit of extra detailing, then it works pretty well. That being said, though, it's on the second-hand market. It has been around a few times. They say for $10 to $20, so I'm guessing USA. But don't be spending more than $10 on it, because it's probably not worth that. But I think this looks good for an old kit. I think it's a 1959 tooling. This is quite impressive, which is why I picked it for the very first image at the beginning, because it just goes to show that this is something that, although some kits, like by today's standards, just wouldn't, you know, if you reviewed this today as a new release, it would be like, what's going on? But with a bit of careful painting and a little bit of detailing, you've done a really good job. Thanks for taking part. Let's move on. 1987 Academy F4F Wildcat in 1/72 scale. So the tooling dates from 1987, but this has been around like a lot. Academy have just have this in their range. The whispers are that this is actually based on the Frog kit, which is why the display stand looks very frog-like. And they effectively upgraded it to have recessed details and some rivets and things. I've built one of these as well. I know it's a chunky kit. I know it's not necessarily the most detailed or accurate kit in the world. But we'll see what this person has to say about it. They like that it came with a display stand, so they could do it in a flying pose. And the biggest weak point is the cockpit. It doesn't have any real detail other than a basic chair, and the pilot just sort of sits on it. It sort of hangs, I think, if I remember correctly, from the roof of the cockpit, which is crazy. The figure does have mushy details. It's not particularly crisp. And they did have some fit issues with putting the gear in a raised position. They would have liked more decals. You only get a handful of decals in this kit, which I can testify. You only get the number 4 for the ID code and the roundels. They said that this one cost £7, which means that they weren't happy about it. And I would agree. I think I picked mine up cheaper than that. I think I know where you got yours if you paid £7 for it in a shop here in the UK, which is known for marking up on prices. I think this has been around for £4 or £5, so it's not really worth more than that. And I think actually the kit itself comes with decals for an FM1 version, but the kit replicates an F4F or something like that, so it's not the paint scheme, for whatever reason they included, doesn't actually replicate the aircraft tooling inside the box. But that's, you know, Academy at this point in their lives with these cheap kits, this is kind of what they did. However, that being said, actually I like yours. I like the way you've done yours. You've added more detailing with your chipping and things like that. Your smoke stains look good. I think when I did mine, my painting wasn't as neat as yours, so yeah, good job. Well done. Thanks for taking part. Let's move on. We're going to move on to another boat. This is a 2025 rebox of the 1975 tooling of the Airfix 1/72nd scale German E-boat. You see, it was a nice and fun build, despite the fact it's over 50 years old. Of course, it's not the most detailed kit in the world, but the fit was pretty good. They did have to do a lot of sanding in a few places, but that was mostly due to the size of the joints rather than being, you know, too big or out of step with each other. The main problem they had was the rigging, because the super glue was not drying fast enough, but they got there in the end. You're going to get some CA glue accelerator for the next time they do some rigging. I can relate to that. It can be, I have heard actually a little bit of water, just a little tiny like misting of water can help accelerate it. They wish they used a slightly darker grey for the hull, but the dark deck does help to make it not look quite as light. You know what? I think you've done a fantastic job. It's quite a big boat, I think, isn't it, when you finished it? And there's quite a lot of little bits and pieces that you need to do. But it wasn't a cheap kit when it was reboxed last year. So on the whole, probably a pretty strong model that Airfix have had in their range on and off over the years, and all those little extra, all those details that you've picked out on there look really good. Very neat painting. So well done. Thanks for taking part. Let's have a look at another Airfix kit. This time it is a Junkers JU88A4 in 72nd scale, which is based on the 1964 tooling, so quite old, but this is the 1982 boxing. I actually really like the boxing style on this one, because it gives an image of someone else's build and you go, oh, you know, that's something to aim for. This is what it might look like at the end of the build. Obviously, I know we move away from that. We use artwork these days for quite a lot of companies, because if you don't have particularly good model on the box, then people might go, oh, maybe I won't buy that one. They say the build was a very vintage experience. Lots of flash, some warping on the mould, yellow decals, raised details. There are posable control surfaces, which was typical of this era. They do say the accuracy is questionable as well. The biggest issue with the kit was the warped fuselage halves and the almost complete lack of detail on the canopy pieces. The fit of these canopy pieces left quite a few gaps. They did use the original decals, which seemed to have gone on okay, but you can see there was a bit of a registration problem, which was probably typical of the printing technology. The guns they used from a different JU88 kit that they had got rid of previously, and the airframe was brush painted freehand. No masks, so they didn't leave any ridges. They used Vallejo model colour. The canopies were masked, and then they used references to guess where to replicate the frames from. They wanted to keep things simple, not do anything too complicated, so there wasn't anything really too far in the scratch building area. They didn't initially have much hope. They didn't have much hope for this kit in the beginning, but they're happy with how this one has finally turned out. I would agree. If you hand painted this, this looks very impressive. This looks like you've done a fantastic job of such an old kit. I know you say you didn't have much in the way of detailing and you had to fix the canopy yourself, but yeah, I think actually yours looks better than the one they've got on the box artwork, so you should be very proud of that one. Well done. Thanks for taking part. Let's move on. This is a JU52 in 1/72 scale from MPC. So this is the rebox of an Airfix kit. So MPC reboxed this in 1973, but it's based on the 1964 tooling from Airfix. They wanted to do a paint scheme for an aircraft that was in Crete, but it's not based on anything historically accurate. It's not a real one. I say the bad things about this kit is that the kit shows its age. There is a lack of details on most of the parts, a lot of fit issues on the kit where the wings and roof kind of meet. The instructions are a bit unclear and the decals just don't go on particularly well, given that it has so much corrugation. However, for the good parts, they say the kit looks okay. It was interesting to see different options for the versions pictured on the box. They say they probably wouldn't recommend this kit unless you have a bit of experience. It's got an average rating. They say it's a 5 out of 10. So maybe a different version would be better, but we know now that Airfix has released a more modern version this year of the JU52, which is probably a better option to have a go at. I think, though, that despite the issues that you've had, you've done a really good job at this one, and I like the way that this one looks in its custom paint scheme. Thanks for taking part. Let's move on. This is a Revell 1 to 220th scale Thermopylae. This is a 1975 tooling, but a 2016 rebox. So Thermopylae was a British tea clipper that actually beat the legendary Cutty Sark in the Great Tea Race of 1872. Ironically, Revell decided to use their 1975 Cutty Sark tooling and then rebrand it as the Thermopylae or Thermopylae, a ship of a different design. So technically it represents one ship, but it's a slightly different. It should be different, basically. They say that this is a kit they've built many times. Sorry, no, years ago. Many years ago. So that's the reason why they bought it again, to have another experience of it. The daunting perspective of doing the rigging and sails meant that it was waiting on the bench for a few months. Everything about this one felt vintage, from the box, the sprues and the instructions. There was flash, thick sprue gates, odd design choices and hard to read diagrams. The most troublesome part were the sails, which come on a large vacuum formed sheet and are poorly designed and mislabeled. They say that their cat decided to body slam the ship 4 times whilst they were adding the sails, which caused the rigging to tear and knocked off parts. I guess your cat really didn't want you to finish this one. Everything was brush painted with the provided Revell Aqua paints, both to honour the age of the kit and to reminisce their youth. It went reasonably well, with only the white, which is a typically tricky paint to use, causing some headaches. But all in all, quite happy with the result. It's far from perfect, but they think it looks good in their display case. It is interesting, I find, that Revell decided to use the Cutty Sark tooling to replicate a completely different ship. So I wonder what the differences would have actually been between the 2 different vessels, and what would need to be changed. That being said, though, as I'm not an expert, I think you did a really good job of this one. It looks nice and clean, and despite the issues you had, you wouldn't have known that your cat decided to attack this one. So well done. Thanks very much. Let's move on. This is a Mr. Craft. We haven't had a Mr. Craft one yet, I don't think. Mr. Craft 1/24 scale Alfetta. This is from a Merit tooling. They're not entirely sure of the precise date, but it's probably somewhere around the late 1950s, so 1957 to 1959 perhaps. It isn't a bad base kit for its time, but they've done a lot of extra work on it to keep the details or add extra details. So I'll just run through some of the things they've added. They added wiring to the wheels. They rebuilt the engine bay with a supercharger and steering gear, exhaust cover and wiring looms. They added Italian arrangement of 4 pedals and fuel tanks in the centre. They put the chassis structure into the cockpit and added brake lines and struts to the axles. So that's quite a bit of extra detailing they've done there to uplift this old tool. Overall, they think the parts count, not including the wired rims, tripled. So they took what the base kit had and then tripled the amount of extra stuff they added onto that. They put the whole kit on a simple vignette base with a figure from Masterbox for a sense of scale and some extra je ne sais quoi. So yeah, I think you've done a really good job with this one. It's a 1950s kit which you've upgraded drastically, and you've done a fantastic paint job on it. You've made a little scene out of it. You've added a figure. I think it just goes to show what can be done with a vintage kit if you take it from its base and then like improve on it. I know Mr. Craft doesn't always make the best reboxes either, so you were starting at a position of disadvantage when you went and did this one. I think you've done a fantastic job. It looks fantastic. It's so good. So thanks for taking part. Let's move on to something a little bit more military aligned. This is a Tamiya SD KFZ 7/1 with quad anti-aircraft gun. This is a alternative history scenario they've come up with. This person does generally come up with alternative histories. Unfortunately, I haven't got the history here. You wrote a lot. You wrote an awful lot about the history of this one, so it does have a slightly different timeline for this. Unfortunately, we don't have that one available, mostly because you wrote so much that I couldn't include it. So hopefully you didn't. If people did want to know, obviously I would point them in your direction on the Discord. They say this is an interesting build, the first of their larger 35th scale military models that they've completed. Due to some real life interference, they did actually have to rush this one a little bit. And they do say that as a result, they think that it shows a little bit in some of the photos. They made some minor modifications. The netting that was meant for the bedsides went into the bit box, and they replaced it with wooden boards made from coffee stirrers. Also, the rear view mirror and those antenna things got lost during handling. They used Italeri, Pentart, Vallejo, and Army Painter paints to complete the kit. And as this is an alternative history scenario, in the sort of the gist of it, retreating Germans offered not only firearms and commando training to Lithuanian partisans, but also some heavier equipment. So the crew manning this gun are anti-Soviet partisans of 1944 to 1953 period, belonging to the Dainava district. So they've created this historical alternative history for why this vehicle looks the way that it does. And you know what? There's nothing. I like that. I think coming up with a what if to fix some issues with a historical model kit is a good idea. This is a fun little project, and if people do want to know more about your history behind this one, I will point them in your direction on the Discord server. Thanks for taking part. Let's move on. This is an MPC Dodge Shelby Charger in 1/25th scale from a tooling of 1984. So this is a modern release with new decals from 2024, but the tooling does date from 1984, and it was mainly used as a test bed for them to learn rust effects and weathering, as they hadn't done that before. Despite the tooling being over 40 years old, there were not any real major issues with flash or the fit of the parts, aside from the axles being a little bit annoying to get them aligned correctly. The instructions weren't great though. They weren't awful, but they could have been a bit better on telling you where to put some of the parts. And although the decals had decent print quality and were fairly flexible, they were a bit of a pain as they were not quite the right size and didn't stick to the model particularly well, despite adding different or various setting solutions to apply them. They were a little bit disappointed that they got a little bit of silvering as a result. For painting, they've used Trem-clad brown spray paint for the body and the hood, or bonnet as we would say here in the UK, and they used a generic grey primer for everything else. The body and rust effects were a mixture of Tamiya, Mr. Hobby and Testors paints, then sealed under Mr. Hobby matte spray. The weathering is based on a few real vehicles that they found online and a Chrysler that they actually own of the same era. Initially, they forgot to include the inside rear view mirror, but decided to run with it as the glue holding the mirror on in Chrysler products of the 80s tend to let go after some time. So this theme is a build of a car that's been abandoned in a driveway for a few decades before eventually being found and given a bit of basic mechanical revival to get it back on the road. They're happy with the end results. They did have some doubts along the way, but they trusted the process and feel it turns out pretty good. It was a neat little subject and a fun build. I like this one. I like the little details, like the cracked windscreen that you can see there in the top image. I like the little engine details that you've added, or picked out on the lower side. The rust effect is very good. I will definitely have to keep this one in mind when I come to do some of my own vehicles, perhaps in an abandoned paint scheme. So yeah, thanks so much for taking part. Let's move on. And this is the final submission that was submitted for the vintage group build. This is a Helicadet 1:300 scale Concorde from 1966. This is not a model of the normal Concorde, but actually one of the prototypes. Both Hella and Airfix released this type of model as marketing 2 years before Concorde's first flight. The model itself does show its age, not only in the moulding, but also its design. It's very simplified, especially in the landing gear area. Although the instructions were simple, they did lack decal position information and a paint scheme, so they had to do some research to figure out where everything went. They say they're not particularly proud of the model as they feel they could have made it better. Unfortunately, they lost one of the French flags on the fuselage, and the nose may have been consumed by a cat. And this seems to be the thing, isn't it, with cats? We have cats and they're not allowed in my modelling room. If they come in here, they're shooed out very quickly because their hair gets everywhere, or they just get into things. So yeah, they're a right pain. Despite your issues, actually, I think this kit looks good. It's an old kit, but you did your best with it. And it is a slightly different prototype version of the Concorde, which makes it something you should be proud of. I know you had your troubles with it, but I think you should put this one on the shelf and reminisce on or reflect on how you did with this one, so that perhaps in the future you can improve. But also, I think even if we do a kit that we're not happy with, we can still be proud of it. So yeah, well done. Thanks for taking part. And that is pretty much it. What did you think of these submissions? Let us know down in the comments. And if you would like to take part in the next group build, well, actually it's the current group build because it's already started. It's over on the Discord server. So all of these group builds happen on the Discord server, and there is a link to the Discord server in the video description. The current group build is on the theme of civilian. So in a nutshell, it's anything to do with a civilian modelling subject. There are more rules if you check out the actual group build itself on what we will class as civilian, but it's an opportunity to do something you might not necessarily do, or perhaps you've got something in your stash that you need a little bit of motivation to do, and we all just sort of crack on with our own little projects and ask for help and give feedback as we need to. So yeah, check out the links below the video if you'd like to take part in that. I'd like to offer massive thanks to everyone who took part this year. I think it was about 40 finished submissions, all to a very good standard. Some old clunky kits which have been turned around wonderfully. Before I sign off, as always, I would also like to remind you that we do have a Model Minutes Model Club, where if you become a member here on YouTube or over on Patreon, you can get exclusive access to early videos and other perks as well. So do check out which ones might be the best for you. Massive thanks to these Model Club members who are on the screen here, because they help to provide me with extra support, which allows me to create fairly consistent content that I can hopefully release quite regularly. Of course, if a Model Club membership isn't quite right for you, but you would still like to support the channel, then there are other ways. But if you're unable to support financially, and I completely understand that times are tough, just subscribing with notifications turned on means you'll never miss a modelling upload. And with that, we are coming to the end of the stream. I'd like to thank you all once again for tuning in, for taking part, and I think it's probably time to leave this one here. So from me here on the workbench, massive thank you to you for watching, and I will see you all again soon.